Sarah Aptilon is Associate Professor of Religious Study at JCCC. Before arriving here, she earned a BA in East Asian Studies from Yale University. During those undergraduate years, she lived and practiced for 7 years in a Buddhist monastery in Kyoto, Japan. And her interest in religious studies as an academic discipline really began there. She also earned a PhD in religious studies with a focus in Buddhist studies from Stanford University. Since 2005, she's served as senior consultant for Japan Intercultural Consulting, offering cross-cultural training and team building sessions for global Japanese companies throughout the US, Mexico, and Canada. Professor Aptilon has been with JCCC for 5 years and teaches Exploring World Religions, Asian Religions, Introduction to Japanese Culture for the Humanities Department, and in the spring she'll be teaching a section of Exploring World Religions for the Honors Program. In addition, she teaches a weekly meditation class for the JCCC Student Wellness Program. If that was not enough, Sarah presents a workshop on Zen meditation for the Greater Kansas City Japan Festival. She teaches meditation classes at Turning Point, which is a part of the University of Kansas Health System. She's offered talks for Night at the Nelson, Noon at the Nerman. She has served on multiple peer review committees, hiring committees for the college as well. She presents papers at the annual conferences of the Japan Studies Association and Asian Studies Development Program. And she writes plays. Her full-length play, Deep Dark Nothingness, will be presented in a staged reading at KC Public Theater in February. And she has a few other theatrical collaborations in the works. Finally, she serves on the board of directors for the Menorah Heritage Foundation, which supports organizations and programs that improve health and well-being in the Kansas City area. And she is currently in the process of translating a book of early 20th century Japanese lectures on Zen practice for a community of Zen teachers in San Francisco. Today's lecture is not about that. Today's lecture will cover James Baldwin's 1953 semi-autobiographical novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain. We asked her why she chose that with all of those varied interests, and she said this, quote, "It is one of the best books I have ever read, and I have never stopped to look into the exact reasons for that. So I welcome this chance to delve more deeply into James Baldwin's world." Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Maureen, for inviting me. Happy to be here. I gave them too many things. Sorry. I just want to have this be like very informal, even though we're videoing it, and welcome everybody who's joining us virtually. So, and I hope to leave some time for questions and discussion at the end. I just, my take on this is very personal, and I'll get into that in a couple minutes, but I thought I would start out by reading you a couple things from this book to kind of just show you what I love about it. And then I'll read another passage later. So just to give you a sense of Baldwin's prose. This is, as Michael just said, this is semi-autobiographical. It's the novel about a young man. It's a 24-hour period on his 14th birthday. He's Black. He grew up growing up in Harlem. He's the son of a Pentecostal preacher. And that's what you need to know to hear the excerpts that I'm going to read you. So the book starts out with a quote, actually. He quotes a lot of different gospel songs and spirituals, which shows how deeply part of his world those songs are. And I love how it opens on the first page. I looked down the line and I wondered. And that's from a song, actually, by Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who was kind of like the first recording artist gospel singer. She was very popular at the time that he was growing up. And the rest of the song goes, well, I looked down the line and I wondered. Yes, I wondered, oh Lord, I wondered. I looked down the line and I wondered just to see how far I was from God. And then he comes back to this song later and has another part of it. So it starts with that, and then I'll just read you the first paragraph here. Everyone had always said that John would be a preacher when he grew up, just like his father. It had been said so often that John, without ever thinking about it, had come to believe it himself. Not until the morning of his 14th birthday did he really begin to think about it, and by then it was already too late. This is how the novel starts. And then I'm going to jump ahead, and I'm just going to read you a page. It's a bit long, but bear with me. Let's see here. Okay. This is John recalling an earlier point in his childhood. He's in school. They were learning the alphabet that day, and 6 children at a time were sent to the blackboard to write the letters they had memorized. 6 had finished and were waiting for the teacher's judgment when the back door opened and the school principal, of whom everyone was terrified, entered the room. No one spoke or moved. In the silence, the principal's voice said, "Which child is that?" She was pointing at the blackboard, at John's letters. The possibility of being distinguished by her notice did not enter John's mind, and so he simply stared at her. Then he realized by the immobility of the other children, and by the way they avoided looking at him, that it was he who was selected for punishment. "Speak up, John," said the teacher gently. On the edge of tears, he mumbled his name and waited. The principal, a woman with white hair and an iron face, looked down at him. "You're a very bright boy, John Grimes," she said. "Keep up the good work." Then she walked out of the room. That moment gave him, from that time on, if not a weapon, at least a shield. He apprehended totally, without belief or understanding, that he had in himself a power that other people lacked, that he could use this to save himself, to raise himself, and that perhaps with this power he might one day win that love which he so longed for. This was not in John a faith subject to death or alteration, not yet a hope subject to destruction. It was his identity, and part, therefore, of that wickedness for which his father beat him and to which he clung in order to withstand his father. His father's arm rising and falling might make him cry, and that voice might cause him to tremble. Yet his father could never be entirely the victor, for John cherished something that his father could not reach. It was his hatred and his intelligence that he cherished, the one feeding the other. He lived for the day when his father would be dying, and he, John, would curse him on his deathbed. And I'll just stop there, but that gives you a sense of a relationship that is central to the novel, which is the relationship between John and his preacher father, who is clearly an abusive person. And I'll say more about that. I'm not going to summarize the book for you because I want you to read it. I'm not going to tell you what happens in it, but I will draw upon just a few things that I think are interesting. But just to go back to why am I talking to you about this book? I was thinking about why is this book so important to me? And I have to say, I'm not completely sure what is so powerful about it. I almost started crying as I was reading it to you. There's something about every line that has this lyricism and kind of irony, embodies the kind of ironies about life that are deeper than I think our conscious minds normally think about. So I first read this book a few years ago, and one of the things that I immediately noticed about it was that it doesn't have clear villains and heroes. It's not really black and white, and it's not in a different sense black and white. It's not clear about this person is evil, this person is good. It's not an indictment of someone and a valorization of someone else. And before I read this, I had actually recently read another book about slavery in the United States, which had the author had drawn upon her grandparents and her ancestors' stories from slavery. And just comparing it, I felt that that book, it was sort of easier to say who's the hero and who's the villain because she had not lived it. I think that's absolutely clear who is the hero and who is the villain in her stories. But I was struck by the fact that when it's your own story, as James Baldwin is, at first he denied it, but it's very clear that this is semi-autobiographical. And when it's your own story, it's more complicated than that. And so we see in this book a kind of longing for love, that the main character longs for his abuser's love, and he and his father both long for love and acceptance from the white world that can never give them that. And it just produces kind of a deep sadness rather than a kind of sense like this person is evil, which is like I think what probably most of the best literary works do in that sense. I think that in a way this book is more religious than a lot of religious texts that I've read, all the while rejecting the kind of veracity of the Pentecostal teachings that its author grew up with, and I'll say more about that in a few minutes. But as I read it, every sentence in the book is an indictment and an embrace, a curse and a prayer. So it's hard to articulate how that is possible. He rejects the hypocrisy, Baldwin rejects the hypocrisy and the violence of the Christian environment that he grew up in, but its influence remains deeply part of him and flows behind his words like the melody of a hymn. So let me just give you a little bit more context for this book. It was published in 1953. It was his first novel. He was only 28 when it was published. I've read like a couple of other novels of his. I mean, it would take years to read all of his novels. He has so many books, and he's an incredibly prolific author. But I think this book is often regarded as his best. And it certainly is the best of the ones that I've read. It's the one that affected me most deeply. He was born in Harlem in 1924. And he died in France in 1987. He was the eldest of 9 children. He was a prolific, as I said, essayist, novelist, and playwright, and his identity as a Black gay man necessarily became a major theme in his work. He spent a lot of his life in France to escape the racism and homophobia that he experienced in the US. So, as I said, it's a semi-autobiographical novel. It takes place during a 24-hour period during the protagonist John Grimes' 14th birthday. So we shouldn't read it as a memoir. It's certainly different from his life, but it does draw heavily upon his early life. And it has a large portion of the book is lengthy flashbacks of the lives, the stories of his aunt, his father, and his mother before he was born. And those narratives harken back to slavery and to the Great Migration, in which 6 million Black people left the South. We can say between 1917 all the way to 1971. So he was also born during the Harlem Renaissance, which we can say more about. That one of his teachers in middle school was a renowned poet in the Harlem Renaissance. So I don't love the book. I don't love it because of its identity politics or its social critiques. And I'm not sure if there are like things, I was kind of hesitant to pick it because I'm not sure if there are things I should say about it or that I shouldn't say about it, just because it's kind of a loaded topic, I suppose, because of, all of the social justice imperatives and diversity, equity, and inclusion and racial questions that are at the forefront of our minds in higher education. Like I was sort of like, but I just want to talk about it from a very personal place. I'm not going to talk about it in a way that maybe I'm supposed to, or hopefully none of you guys don't think that I'm supposed to talk about it in a certain way. Some similarities between Baldwin's life and the book. He, like the narrator, was born out of wedlock without ever knowing his father, so his parents were never married. And he was adopted by his intensely religious, abusive stepfather, a Pentecostal preacher. This is something that he and his protagonist, John Grimes, share in common. Baldwin, like the narrator, was saved at the age of 14 and went on to preach in the Pentecostal church until he was 17. That's true of James Baldwin, and it's true of John Grimes. And Baldwin, like the narrator, grapples with his place in the world as a young Black man in Harlem, confronted with the stark choice of following the way of the avenue, he calls it, which is where the pimps, prostitutes, and drug dealers dwell, and the church. And so those are kind of his two choices, and he finds his way to the church. Going back a little bit more details about Baldwin's life, because this is autobiographical, I think, or semi-autobiographical, I think we have to understand it in the context of his life, particularly in the case of this book. He was born as James Arthur Jones in 1924. He was the grandson of a slave, and that comes into the book also. He was born during the Harlem Renaissance, as I said. He's said to be the first writer born and raised in Harlem. He's certainly one of the first. His mother came from Maryland as part of the Great Migration, fleeing segregation, arriving in Harlem at age 19. And his father, his stepfather, David Baldwin, was from Bunkie, Louisiana. And his mother, Emma, married him. He was a laborer and a preacher in 1927. So James was only 3 when they got married. And he adopted him as his son, and that's why his last name is Baldwin. He grew up in a Harlem neighborhood named Junkies Hollow. You can imagine what that suggests. And one of the resources that I found to be really helpful in understanding this book is a pair of essays called The Fire Next Time, written in the form of letters. The longer of the 2 letters was published originally in the New Yorker. But I found that it kind of told his own personal story in a that book tells his autobiographical story in parallel to what we see in Go Tell It on the Mountain. So if you read Go Tell It on the Mountain, reading The Fire Next Time is a very valuable way to understand his actual life as a context for the book. This is something he writes about his neighborhood in The Fire Next Time. For the wages of sin were visible everywhere, in every wine-stained and urine-splashed hallway, in every clanging ambulance bell, in every scar on the faces of the pimps and their whores, in every helpless newborn baby being brought into this danger, in every knife and pistol fight on the avenue, and in every disastrous bulletin. A cousin mother of 6 suddenly gone mad, the children parceled out here and there, an indestructible aunt rewarded for years of hard labor by a slow, agonizing death in a terrible small room, someone's bright son blown into eternity by his own hand, another turned robber and carried off to jail. This is how he writes about, where he grew up. He also identified as Southern. He writes also, my father was a son of a slave. I'm really a Southerner born in the North. So that was interesting. And I'll just click ahead here. This is his, it's a tenement, like, it's not the one where he necessarily grew up in, but it's like where he grew up in the 1930s. Gives you just a sense of what that was like. This is actually Baldwin as a young man holding one of his young siblings. So he's on the left there with his mother. He was very close to her. There aren't too many pictures that survive from that time. As the eldest of 9 children, he took very seriously the responsibility of being a big brother and his mother's right hand. So he really, especially after the death of his stepfather, he was really kind of a parent figure to them. He later described his stepfather, just as a side note, brooding, silent, tyrannical, and physically abusive. He was also a storefront preacher of morbid intensity. That's how he describes him, which is similar to John Grimes's stepfather in the book. And in the book, John Grimes's stepfather has a biological son, which he openly favors. He's older in the book. And that tension is always with John because he's always the kind of the unfavored child. I'm going to show you, this is not his church, but it is a Pentecostal church from around this time. It's in Chicago. But I want to just let you know that he preached from age 14 to 17 at the Fireside Pentecostal Assembly, which was a storefront church in Harlem located 136 and Fifth Avenue. And so that's the period of his life. There's a lot of that in Go Tell It on the Mountain. And the church had a deep influence on his writing, how he writes, and also those specific experiences. He actually describes meeting a female pastor who was very important in his development along these lines, and he describes meeting her at his friend's church, and she said to him, "Whose little boy are you?" And he was struck by that question because that's what they would ask people out on the avenue, "Whose little boy are you?" But it would be more like pimps asking, who do you belong to? Which bad person here? Which person owns you? But here he was being asked, "Whose little boy are you?" And he immediately answered, "Why, yours." And that's how his life in the church began. I actually read 2 different accounts of whether he preached in his stepfather's church. I believe that he says that he preached in this woman's church. I'm not totally clear about that. But just to say a word about Pentecostalism, it's characterized by possession, spirit possession, like the Holy Spirit, and speaking in tongues, glossolalia. It's actually said to have originated in Topeka, Kansas in 1901 when a young female student at Bethel Bible College suddenly began speaking in tongues. And this ultimately spread throughout the United States. It's extremely popular. By one account, there are some 80 million Pentecostal Christians today. There developed a kind of black branch, for the black population and white branch of Pentecostal Christianity. And for me, it's interesting because black churches have a sort of latent experience of spirit possession from African religious traditions. And so this is related to that. I think it caught on very easily because of those spirit possession practices, except the possession is by the Holy Spirit, so it's interesting. But anyway, Baldwin ultimately rejected this world. He did not stay in it, but he always had conflicted feelings about that. And he writes, one of the things he writes about it, he says, if the concept of God has any validity or any use, it can only be to make us larger, freer, and more loving. If God cannot do this, it is time we got rid of him. So that's one thing that he wrote. And I think that he did actually do away with his old conception of God, and something took its place. And what took its place? I'm not sure we can articulate that, but I feel like this book is an attempt to articulate that, whether he thought of it that way or not. He also writes in The Fire Next Time, in spite of everything, there was in the life I fled a zest and a joy and a capacity for facing and surviving disaster that are very moving and very rare. Perhaps we were, all of us, pimps, whores, racketeers, church members, and children, bound together by the nature of our oppression, the specific and peculiar complex of risks we had to run. If so, within these limits, we sometimes achieved with each other a freedom that was close to love. And he talks a lot about freedom. That's a theme that I want to come back to. Freedom, what does freedom mean? That's very important to him. When he left the church when he was 17, he started reading novels again, read Dostoevsky, wanted to write, just felt that he couldn't do that in that environment. And he writes about a conversation with his stepfather. He calls him his father. He says, my father asked me abruptly, you'd rather write than preach, wouldn't you? I was astonished by his question because it was a real question. I answered yes. That was all we said. It was awful to remember that was all we had ever said. They never had real conversations. I think that's what he means there. So in 1942, he graduated from high school. In 1943, his stepfather died. He witnessed the Harlem race riot in which 6 people died, which was a momentous event where he lived, and he moved to Greenwich Village. He wanted to become a writer. But of course, he couldn't go to college. He was taking care of his 8 brothers and sisters. So he worked at different menial jobs during the day and at night played guitar in cafes and wrote for long hours trying to fulfill his dream of writing, becoming a writer. In 1948, at age 24, he left the United States to live in Paris, and because he just could not tolerate the discrimination that he was experiencing every day, even in that kind of progressive environment in the village. And he explained in a Paris Review interview from 1984, my luck was running out. I was going to go to jail. I was going to kill somebody or be killed. And from then on, he lived abroad for most of his life after that. He lived from 1948 to 1957 in France, traveling a lot in Europe, and then 1961 to 1970 in Istanbul, traveled a lot in Turkey during that time. He also became very involved in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. He attended the March on Washington in 1963 and the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965. I'll come back to this. This is actually in Switzerland around the time that he published the novel. The great love of his life was this man, Lucien Happersberger, and he spent more or less from 1950 to 1953, a lot of that time in a little snowy village in Switzerland where a lot of people had never even seen a Black person. And he found it kind of strange and oppressive, but also liberating. And that's when he finished the book, Go Tell It on the Mountain. So here he is together with Lucien. He claims in this news clip that it was not autobiographical, but we know that was not true. So, this is later in the 60s. He wasn't preaching anymore, but he did give a lot of talks in churches. And this is the march in Alabama that he was part of, for voting rights. He's there. Anyway, like with Joan Baez is in the middle there. So after the assassination of his three friends, Medgar Evers in 1963, Malcolm X in 1965, and Martin Luther King in 1968, he experienced an emotional kind of a mental breakdown, and he moved eventually to the south of France to recover. So in 1971, he settled in a house in the village of Saint-Paul-de-Vence. And he died in 1987, November 30th, 1987, in France at that house. It was sort of like the most stable household that he ever had. And a week later, he was laid to rest at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City, and he was buried at the Ferncliff Cemetery in New York. So I want to also recount, I'm just going to go back to that slide. During this time in Switzerland, he finished the book, and he also came up with the title for the book when he was once out hiking in the mountains. And what happened apparently is that he slipped and almost like fell to his death. But at that moment, Lucien grabbed his hand. He was a much more experienced climber, and Baldwin was saved. And so it was out of this kind of terrifying moment that he came up with the idea to call the book Go Tell It on the Mountain. And I just want to say something more about the title, Go Tell It on the Mountain. It's also from a song, right? Have you heard that song before? Go tell it on the mountain, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain that Jesus Christ is born, is one version of it. There are various versions of it. And it alludes to a passage from the prophet Isaiah in the Hebrew Bible. How beautiful are the feet of the herald on the mountains, announcing peace, heralding good tidings, announcing salvation, saying to Zion, your God has manifested his kingdom. The voice of your watchmen, they raise a voice. Together they shall sing, for eye to eye they shall see when the Lord returns to Zion. Burst out in song, sing together, O ruins of Jerusalem, for the Lord has consoled his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. So here, the Go Tell It on the Mountain, right? What is the telling? What is being told here? In a way, during his preaching career, we can talk about John Grimes and James Baldwin. But specifically in the book, John Grimes is preaching the gospel. He's preaching about the Holy Spirit. He's speaking in tongues. People are speaking in tongues. That's one meaning of Go Tell It on the Mountain, the good news of salvation. But he also, in the telling of this story, reveals the church in all of its cruelty, hypocrisy, and falsehood. He also tells of the darkness, the bitter irony, the rejection of shame, the rejection of cruelty. So he rejects all of that darkness, and he goes forth to a new life. He's kind of cast out and he goes out. So what is being told? A lot of things are being told here. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is that the three flashbacks that I mentioned of his aunt, his father, and his mother, they're referred to, that section of the book is called the prayers of the saints. They call each other saints at his church. They just call each other saints. And to me, what that suggests is that their stories are their prayers. I just think it's an interesting and beautiful choice to call them the prayers of the saints. And I'm going to read you one more passage, kind of related to the passage that I read you earlier. This is from Gabriel's prayer. And Gabriel is the father. Gabriel's the father of John, the preacher. Gabriel's the preacher. And so here in this brief passage, we have a young man named Elisha who has just fallen to the floor speaking in tongues. And I will also say that Roy, who is referred to here, is the older son of Gabriel. the biological son of John Grimes's father. They're standing in the church. And this is describing the perspective, actually, of John Grimes. This is talking about John from the perspective of his father. Then, as he stood with the others over the fallen Elisha, John rose from his knees. He bent a dazed, sleepy, frowning look on Elisha and the others, shivering a little as though he were cold. And then he felt his father's eyes and looked up at his father. At the same moment, Elisha from the floor began to speak in a tongue of fire under the power of the Holy Ghost. John and his father stared at each other, struck dumb and still, and with something come to life between them, while the Holy Ghost spoke. Gabriel had never seen such a look on John's face before. Satan, at that moment, stared out of John's eyes while the Spirit spoke. And yet John's staring eyes tonight reminded Gabriel of other eyes, of his mother's eyes when she beat him, of Florence's eyes when she mocked him, of Deborah's eyes when she prayed for him, of Esther's eyes and Royal's eyes and Elizabeth's eyes tonight before Roy cursed him, and of Roy's eyes when Roy said, "You black bastard." And John did not drop his eyes, but seemed to want to stare forever into the bottom of Gabriel's soul. That's another passage that tells you about their relationship, tells you about this is part of Gabriel's prayer, Gabriel's story. You can feel the kind of humiliation that he feels, right? And you can imagine his abusiveness coming out of his having been abused and his own humiliation. That's what I mean by the complexity of the dynamics in the story. So I just want to say one last thing here about freedom and James Baldwin's notion of freedom. It was interesting because I went to the Statue of Liberty earlier in the summer with my daughter, and there was, you see James Baldwin's quotes everywhere, not just in a context of racial equality or something, they're everywhere. He's very often quoted, and there was a framed quote prominently displayed in the museum of the Statue of Liberty. And it said something like, I'll just paraphrase because I couldn't find the exact quote, but it said something like, "What is liberty anyway? Nobody ever stops to ask that question." And he did stop to ask that question. And I just want to mention a couple of things. This is actually from a 1985 Ken Burns documentary. He spoke more about this. And I think maybe that's where the quote is from. He says, "What is liberty? Oh, well, that's quite a question. No one really asks themselves that question." And then he says, this is James Baldwin speaking in the documentary. He says, "Well, I can always quote the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And the moment I do that, I'm in trouble again, because obviously I was not included in that pronouncement." And then he starts to speak more about liberty, and he says, he's asked, what is liberty? And he says, "I suppose it occurs on two levels. One is inside, one is outside. So that finally, or first of all, perhaps liberty is individual passion or the will to be free. But this passion, this will, is always contradicted by the necessities of the state, everywhere, for as long as we've heard of mankind and as long as we've heard of states. I don't know if it will be like that forever. For a Black American, the Statue of Liberty is a very bitter joke, meaning nothing to us." And yet, another irony is that his words are enshrined in the Statue of Liberty Museum, which I think is important. So he's talking about outward freedom and inward freedom, and I think both of those things are very important to him. Civil rights, that was part of his efforts to bring about freedom for his people. And I just want to say a couple more things, read you a couple of more passages about his view of freedom, because to sum up his message about what is freedom, what does it mean to bring about equality in this country? He kind of says, I'm just going to say this in my words, it's not really about whether you're Black or white. There's a deeper issue here. And the oppressor needs to look inward and be very honest, because Baldwin is a truth teller. That is his way of praying. That is his way of activism. And I think he basically wants to tell us look at yourself, because that's the problem. Is not about whether someone is black or white. Oppression and hatred come from something else. That's not what it is. And we have to look at ourselves. And he basically says people hate to avoid pain. And so we have to look at that pain. And I think that's powerful. He says, there appears to be a vast amount of confusion on this point, but I do not know many Negroes who are eager to be accepted by white people, still less to be loved by them. They, the blacks, simply don't wish to be beaten over the head by the whites every instant of our brief passage on this planet. That's one of the things he says. I'm going to read you just a couple of last things. It is the responsibility of free men to trust and to celebrate what is constant. Birth, struggle, and death are constant, and so is love, though we may not always think so, and to apprehend the nature of change, to be able and willing to change. I speak of change not on the surface, but in the depth, change in the sense of renewal. But renewal becomes impossible if one supposes things to be constant that are not. Safety, for example, or money or power. One clings then to chimeras by which one can only be betrayed, and the entire hope, the entire possibility of freedom disappears. And by destruction, I mean precisely the abdication by Americans of any effort really to be free. I chose this, it sounds very Buddhist to me actually, like clinging to the impermanent things, that's always gonna cause and perpetuate this kind of suffering. And last thing, I'll read you one last quote. And I submit then that the racial, this is also from The Fire next time, and I submit then that the racial tensions that menace Americans today have little to do with real antipathy. On the contrary, indeed, and are involved only symbolically with color. These tensions are rooted in the very same depths as those from which love springs or murder. The white man's unadmitted and apparently to him unspeakable private fears and longings are projected onto the Negro. So that is what he asks us. And at the end of the documentary, I Am Not Your Negro, which is a very important documentary about his involvement with the civil rights movement, he makes the same point. This is not about race. We have to look at, or you, he says, I would say, like white people have to look at what is it really about. For Baldwin, race isn't the real problem. Whatever the real problem is, we haven't figured it out yet. But it is a fundamental problem of confronting ourselves honestly. Once we do that, the race problem will solve itself. So I recall these stories in the novel, of John Grimes and his aunt, his father and his mother, the prayers of the saints, their suffering, their journeys, their burdens. Their stories are their prayers, and Baldwin's stories are his. Thank you. Do we have any time for? Okay, good.
Thank you, Sarah. We have time for some questions. I'll come around with the mic if you have one. Well, I have one. You said sort of one of the structural devices of the novel are the flashbacks and the use of this 24-hour period. So time seems important. It also seems to me that time and our relationship to it is part of our spiritual health. Do you think the book makes some comment on time and how we relate to it?
That's a really good question. I haven't thought of it in exactly that way, but I think coming to terms with the past, coming to terms with, like, the past is creating the present. I think that's what I would say about that. And that's why his writing and his narratives are a way of confronting the past of his family members, of his own past. So I don't know if it's kind of a theoretical commentary on time or a need to confront the traumas and sorrows and pain of the past to move forward in freedom. I don't know. I mean, there probably is a lot more that one could say about it, but certainly it's unusual, and it's the way time is constructed, because first of all, just to have a 24-hour period be the entire range of the novel, right, is interesting. And then to have, like, the longest section by far is these flashbacks, right? So John Grimes and his life right now, preaching and having these experiences in the church, is framing a much deeper kind of collective experience of trauma and suffering that comes forth in the midst of the book, And when he has an experience of being saved, which he did, Baldwin did, and his character does, and in that experience of being saved, it's the upwelling of generations of suffering. That's kind of how he describes it. So I look at it as, it's a collective understanding of suffering, not individual.
Thank you for being here and lecturing. The three people you mentioned, all three that are in the movie, I think it came out in 2017, I'm Not Your Negro. What was his relationship? Was he a close friend of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers?
I think he was a close friend. I don't know a lot about that. But he was close to all of them. He was personally close to all of them, yeah. So I'm not sure, that's a good question. That's one of the reasons I didn't know if I wanted to talk about this book, because I'm not really a scholar of Baldwin or anything. There's a lot I don't know, but it's a good question. But I know that he was so personally close to them that it was devastating for him. Thank you. And if anyone else knows the answer to that question, please tell us. Was he close friends with all three of them? I don't know. But yeah.
Yes, thank you for being here today. I didn't read the book, but I listened to it, and it was very lyrical. And my question for you is, and you've read his other books too, is, he doesn't sound like he had a whole lot of schooling. So where did he get his technical ability to do the writing? From the Bible? Because the book that I listened to sounded very biblical, with the lyricism and things like that. So if you could, tell us about his other books.
That's a really good question. I think that he did a lot of his writing style comes from his preaching style. I do think that's for sure. That was a huge influence. And because this book was written closest to that time in his life, it's most deeply affected by that. I read the next two novels, two other of his early novels, Giovanni's Room, which is all about, his gay relationship and awakening as a gay man and his inner struggles around that, and Another Country. These are two others of his early novels, but in a way, they're nothing like this. They do not have the same kind of biblical, lyrical, hymn-like, prayerful quality. And that's what I find so powerful about this. So I do think he just read voraciously and was a very gifted, brilliant person. And I think that is how he got his style. But I do know that scholars say that his preaching influenced how he wrote very deeply. Yeah. And the Bible, of course, and all the songs. He has many song lyrics in here throughout, which are powerful gospel songs. I was going to play one of them for you. Maybe I'll play it afterwards, but yeah, they're very beautiful. And so I think the way he uses them is powerful. I was once told in a writing class, don't put song lyrics into your writing, but he does it beautifully. So maybe I didn't do it as well. So, yeah, thank you. Yeah.
You may not know anything about this, and I know I'm not at a music conference, but I had no idea that he referenced Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Mm-hmm. I also had no idea that he played guitar. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, partially, I don't know how much you know about Sister Rosetta Tharpe, but there's been, in popular music studies, there's been a lot of scholarship about her in recent years, basically saying that the historiography of rock and roll, generally it used to be well, let's start with jump blues and Louis Jordan and then talk about Chuck Berry, but she's rocking in her performance. That would be when I play her for students, they're whoa, she's playing an SG, which famously is what Angus Young from AC/DC plays.
Yeah, she's playing electric guitar.
And she's really, I'm curious if you just happen to know, and you probably don't, because why would you know this? But what music was he playing? And was he I'm wondering, was he playing stuff like her, or do you have any idea about that?
I have no idea, David, but please find out for us.
I'll try. I have nothing to do today.
But I think that he was surely playing, what we now call roots music, you could also call it, but also religious songs. I'm sure because that's how his education was in that realm. But I don't know. It would be great to find out if there are any recordings. In the village? Yeah, folk music, yeah, right? I don't know. Bob Dylan. Yeah, he was. Yeah, so that was later in the 60s, but you know, that early, right? When he was just like 18, 19 years old, what was he playing? You know, I don't know. In the early 40s?
I'm picturing him like, because again, Sister Without a Thought performances are like, you know, very, what we now, it's really easy to see her as a sort of connection to the rock tradition. I'm just like, was James Baldwin rocking out in these cafes? Like,
We should find out.
no.
Yeah. Thanks for asking.
Any other questions? Thank you, Sarah.